My eyes struggled to become familiar with my surroundings. The gunfire had ceased, and the village was quiet, so I assumed that the attackers had been successfully driven away. I felt a brief relief for that, but the pain in my foot returned, causing the veins in my entire body to tighten. I tucked my lips in, closed my heavy eyelids, and held tight to the edges of the wooden bed. I heard footsteps of people entering the house. They stood by my bed, and as soon as they began to speak, I recognized their voices. The boy is suffering, and we have no medicine here to lessen his pain. Everything is at our former base. The sergeant doctor sighed and continued. It'll take 6 days to send someone to get the medicine and return. He will die from the pain by then. We have to send him to the former base then. We need those provisions from that base anyway. Do all you can to make sure the boy stays alive, the lieutenant said, and walked out. Yes, sir, the sergeant doctor said, and sighed even longer. I slowly opened my eyes, and this time I could see clearly. I looked at his sweaty face and tried to smile a little, but after having heard what they said, I swore to myself that I would fight and do anything for my squad after my foot was healed. We will get you some help. Just be strong, young man, the sergeant doctor said gently, sitting by my bed and examining my leg. Yes, sir, I said, and tried to raise my hand to salute him, but he tenderly brought my hand down. Two soldiers came into the house and told the sergeant doctor that the lieutenant had sent them to help take me to our former base. They took me off the bed, placed me in a hammock, and carried me outside. The sun blinded me at first, and then the treetops of the village began to spin around as they carried me out of the village. The journey felt as if it took a month. I fainted and awoke many times, and each time I opened my eyes, it seemed as if the voices of those who carried me were fading into the distance. Finally, we got to the base, and the sergeant doctor went to work on me. I was injected with something. I had no idea we had needles at the base, but in my condition, I couldn't ask what was happening. I was given cocaine as I frantically demanded it. The doctor started operating on me before the drugs took effect. The other soldiers held my hands and stuffed a cloth into my mouth. The doctor stuck a crooked-looking scissors inside my wound and fished for the bullet. I could feel the edge of the metal inside me. My entire body was racked with pain. My bones became sour. Just when I thought I had had enough, the doctor abruptly pulled the bullet out. A piercing pain rushed up my spine from my waist to the back of my neck, and I fainted. When I regained consciousness, it was the morning of the next day and the drugs had kicked in. I looked about the room and saw on the table the instruments that had been used for my operation. Next to the instruments was a piece of cloth soaked with blood, and I wondered how much blood I'd lost during the operation. I reached my hands down to my foot and felt the bandage before I stood up and limped outside, where some soldiers and the sergeant were sitting. Where's my weapon? I asked them. The sergeant handed me the G3 that was on top of the motor, and I began cleaning it. I shot a couple of rounds sitting against a wall, ignoring the bandage on my foot and everyone else. I smoked marijuana, ate, and snorted cocaine and brown. That was all I did for 3 days before we left for the new base that we had captured. When we left, we threw kerosene on the thatched roof houses and lit them with matches, and fired a couple of RPGs into the walls. We always destroyed the bases we abandoned so that other squads wouldn't be able to use them. Two soldiers carried me in the hammock, but this time I had my gun, and I looked left and right as we traveled the forest path. At the new base, I stayed put for 3 weeks and appointed Al-Haji to be in charge of my expedition squad. I busied myself with drugs and cleaning my gun. The sergeant doctor cleaned my wounds and would always say, "You are lucky." At that time, I didn't think I was lucky. I thought I was brave and knew how to fight. Little did I know that surviving the war that I was in, or any other kind of war, was not a matter of feeling trained or brave. These are just things that made me feel I was immune from death. At the end of 3 weeks, we'd had the first batch of attackers. The lieutenant knew they were coming. I tightened the bandage around my foot, picked up my gun, and followed my squad to ambush the attackers before they got anywhere near our village. We killed most of them and captured a few whom we brought back to the base. These are the men responsible for the bullet holes in your foot. It's time to make sure that they never shoot at you or your comrades. The lieutenant pointed at the prisoners. I'm not sure if one of the captives was the shooter, but any captive would do at that time. So they were all lined up, 6 of them with their hands tied. I shot them in their feet and watched them suffer for an entire day before finally shooting them in the head so that they would stop crying. Before I shot each man, I looked at him and saw how his eyes gave up hope and steadied before I pulled the trigger. I found their somber eyes irritating. When I finished telling Esther the story, she had tears in her eyes, and she couldn't decide whether to rub my head or hug me. In the end, she didn't either, but said, "None of what happened was your fault. You were just a little boy, and any time you want to tell me something, I'm here to listen." She stared at me, trying to catch my eye so she could assure me of what she had just said. I became angry and regretted that I had told someone, a civilian, about my experience. I hated the "it's not your fault" line that all the staff members said every time anyone spoke about the war. I got up, and as I started walking into the hospital, Esther began to speak. "I will arrange for a full checkup at the Connaught Hospital." She paused and then continued. "Let me keep the Walkman. You don't want the others to envy you and steal it. I'll be here every day, so you can come and listen to it any time." I threw the Walkman at her and left, putting my fingers in my ears so I couldn't hear her say, "It's not your fault." That night, I sat on the veranda listening to some of the boys discuss the volleyball game I'd missed. I tried to think about my childhood days, but it was impossible, as I began getting flashbacks of the first time I slit a man's throat. The scene kept surfacing to my memory like lightning on a dark, rainy night, and each time it happened, I heard a sharp cry in my head that made my spine hurt. I went inside and sat on my bed facing the wall and tried to stop thinking, but I had a severe migraine that night. I rolled my head on the cold cement floor, but it didn't stop. I went to the shower room and put my head under the cold water, but that didn't help either. The headache became so severe that I couldn't walk. I began to cry out loud. The night nurse was called. She gave me some sleeping tablets, but I still couldn't fall asleep, even after my migraine stopped. I couldn't face the nightmares I knew would come. Esther got me to tell her some of my dreams. She would listen and sit quietly with me. If she wanted to say anything, she would first ask, "Would you like me to say something about your dream?" Mostly I would say no and ask for the Walkman. One afternoon, Esther wasn't supposed to work, but she came to the center wearing a jean skirt instead of her normal white uniform. She came in a white Toyota with two men. One of the men was the driver, and the other was a field worker for the Children Associated with War, CAW. This was a Catholic organization that partnered with UNICEF and NGOs to create centers like ours. "You are going to the hospital for your examination, and after that we'll give you a tour of the city." Esther was excited. "What do you say?" she asked me. "Okay," I agreed. I was always excited to go to the city. "Can my friend Alhaji come?" I asked. "Sure," she said, as if she knew I would ask. As we drove into Freetown, the field worker introduced himself. "My name is Leslie. It is a pleasure to meet you, gentlemen." He turned around on the front seat and shook our hands. He sat back and studied us in the rearview mirror. Esther sat between Alhaji and me in the back seat. She tickled us and sometimes put her arms around us. I resisted this affection, and she'd put both of her arms around Alhaji. I'd look away, and she'd softly elbow me before putting her arm around me again. At the center of the city, Esther pointed out the post office, the shops, the UN building, and the cotton tree. On Wallace Johnson Street, traders played loud music and rang bells to attract customers. Boys and girls carried coolers on their heads, shouting, "Cold ice, cold ginger beer." The city always amazed me, with its busy people hurrying up and down and its traders noisily creating its unique sound. I was watching one ringing a bell and throwing the second-hand clothes he was selling up in the air to attract passerby when our car stopped at the hospital where I was to be examined. The doctor kept asking, "You feel anything?" as he touched and squeezed parts of my body where I'd been wounded or shot. I was beginning to get upset when he told me he was finished. I put my clothes on and came back into the waiting area where Esther, Leslie, and Alhaji sat. They were smiling. Esther walked up and pulled my nose to cheer me up. We strolled over to the market area where we'd driven past. I spent most of my time studying the rack of cassettes under a kiosk. Esther and Alhaji looked at soccer jerseys, and she bought him one. Leslie brought me a Bob Marley cassette. It was the Exodius album. I grew up on reggae music, but I had not heard it for a while. As I looked at the cassette, trying to remember the songs, my head began to hurt. Esther must have noticed what was happening to me because she took the cassette from me and put it in her bag. "Who wants Coca-Cola?" she asked. I was excited and ran ahead to the Coca-Cola stand. She bought us each a bottle. It was cold and it teased my teeth. I savored it as we drove back to the center. I was in high spirits, smiling all the way. Leslie took this opportunity to tell me that he had been assigned to me and a few other boys. Part of his job was to find a place for me to live after I had completed my rehabilitation. "If you ever need to talk to me at any time, go to Esther's office and she'll call me, okay?" I nodded in agreement with the Coca-Cola bottle in my mouth.